1918, the world had been at war for more than 4 years. The Central Powers, led by Germany, continued to face the allies formed by the United Kingdom, France, the United States, and their partners. The conflict, which had been reduced to a duel of attrition, had finally been resolved, and everyone saw that it was coming to an end. And to the surprise of many, the German Empire was the one that was at a disadvantage. Its desperate high command only had one ace up its sleeve, a final offensive to break down enemy lines. But we must ask ourselves, what were the factors that led the Kaiser's forces to this position? Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will analyze them one by one, breaking down the problems of this troubled nation. Stay with us to understand why Germany lost the First World War. On March 21, 1918, the Imperial German Army launched the Kaiserschlacht, better known as the Spring Offensive. Nearly 1 million men charged savagely into enemy trenches, seeking to break the stalemate on the Western Front. German officers knew that this attack would most likely decide who would win World War I. The Americans, who had only recently joined the conflict, did not yet have a large presence in Europe. For this reason, the Kaiser's empire had to attack. It was now or never. The offensive began favorably for the Germans. They gained hundreds of kilometers of territory, much of which they had lost in the previous years. The British and French were forced to retreat, ceding many of their resources to the enemy. However, this initial momentum could not be maintained. Despite the German advance, their losses were catastrophic, with thousands dead every day. Moreover, the logistical problems that plagued the empire throughout the war were once again present during this attack. Infantry was advancing out of range of their supply lines, and military commanders, lacking a clear objective, were issuing orders that contradicted previous directives. The Allies, for their part, while suffering many dead and wounded, were able to retreat in good shape and prevent their lines from collapsing. Their tactics involved concentrating their forces at vital points and sacrificing terrain of no strategic value.
Supported by gas shelling and stormtroopers, the struggle was as fierce as ever. However, once again, the Allied line held, much of the strain taken up by a variety of Dominion forces.
By July 18, 1918, the offensive had lost steam. While a German victory could be announced, the only thing the Kaiserschlacht really achieved was to hasten its final defeat, exhausting its resources and its fighters. Due to the almost 1 million dead, the numerical superiority that the Germans had vanished. 4 months after this supposed great victory, the German Empire would sign its unconditional surrender, and the First World War would come to an end. This result was not what people imagined in 1914, before the beginning of hostilities. The Kaiser's forces were considered some of the most imposing on the entire planet. This, added to their initial successes, made many consider that the German victory would not be long in coming. So, what were the reasons why this world power collapsed so spectacularly? At the beginning of the war, Germany had achieved great victories against its enemies. They were able to push deep into Belgium and France, reaching within a few miles of Paris and inflicting hundreds of thousands of casualties. Even when the battles took their soldiers to the Russian steppes, they managed to emerge victorious against the Tsar's armies. Despite the war on two fronts, the Germans seemed unbeatable. But this series of initial successes masked a problem that would become apparent in the later years of the conflict. German leaders greatly underestimated their enemies while exaggerating the qualities of their own troops. While their army was indeed powerful, they were outnumbered in resources and men by the alliance of the United Kingdom, France, and their partners. The German victory plan was based on a lightning attack that would end the war before it really began. But this did not happen. For some historians, the chances of Germany winning the conflict quickly evaporated in 1915.
The Army High Command generally saw no political solution to the war, and so insisted on and mistakenly believed in their own military superiority until it was too late to avoid defeat. The Kaiser and High Command stuck to maximalist war aims at the cost of a potentially more effective strategy. They still insisted on annexing Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of France until summer 1918.
As the years passed and German resources dwindled, The errors of leadership became more noticeable and their consequences more severe. On the Western Front, the advance of the imperial armies stagnated and became a war of attrition in which the vast resources of the Allies took their toll. Despite their losses, the Germans were never able to break through their defensive lines and achieve the collapse they sought. This stagnation in their advances greatly frustrated the Kaiser's military advisors, who began to think of other ways to defeat their enemies. Some argued that the successes they could not achieve on land could be achieved by sea. Thus, in 1917, Germany resumed the almost unrestricted use of its submarines. At the beginning of the war, these vessels had achieved great victories against British warships and merchant ships. However, they also came at a high cost. German submarines attacked any ship in English waters, regardless of whether it belonged to neutral countries. This led to the death of 128 American citizens when the cruiser Lusitania was sunk in 1915. Wanting to prevent the American power from entering the war, Germany restricted the use of submarines. But 2 years later, in desperation, they gave the green light for the attacks to begin again. For the United States, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on the Empire.
Their prospects for victory once the US joined in 1917 were intact, while the German High Command admitted in late 1916 it could not defeat the Allies on land in the West. So Germany failed to win a quick victory in 1914, then saw its chances for avoiding defeat further reduced by mistakes in the following years.
Another point that put a nail in the German coffin was that it did not know how to take advantage of the technological changes that occurred on the battlefield of the First World War. All the belligerent countries had to deal with new weapons, such as tanks, airplanes, and machine guns. Some of them, accustomed to the more static wars of the previous century, suffered an exorbitant number of deaths due to maintaining their outdated doctrines. In the first years, Germany was able to take advantage of the change in military paradigm. It gave a key role to artillery, something unthinkable years before. It was even the first country to deploy chemical weapons, which, although prohibited by international treaties, proved effective in killing and demoralizing the enemy. However, the Allies were able to take better advantage of their resources and reverse their situation. The use of tanks, mainly by the British, revived the Western Front, diminishing the effectiveness of the trenches where the Germans took refuge and accelerating the fall of the empire.
The Germans had effective stormtrooper infantry tactics and innovated artillery tactics thanks to artillery officer Georg Bruchmüller, but they couldn't turn them into a campaign-winning strategy. The Allies, on the other hand, adapted and collaborated.
The revitalization of the front, coupled with the entry of the Americans, put the Germans in a desperate situation. The return to the use of submarines by the Germans caused the British to further strengthen their naval blockade, prohibiting them from receiving resources from their allies. The empire began to see its food reserves fall without anything they could do to recover them. The citizens, tired of a war which their leaders had assured would be won in a short time, began to rebel. Within the nation, massive strikes took place, mainly in the arms industries, whose workers worked without rest or benefits. The lack of resources did not only have consequences at the local level. In fact, it was one of the main reasons that led to Germany not being able to take advantage of its initial victories against the Allies. On many occasions, they had to ration their food or even go days without food. Likewise, their men did not have the necessary ammunition to carry out their attacks. Even the equipment that arrived at the front was often not in good condition. This problem was present in the empire from the first attacks in 1914 until the spring offensive of 1918. If the supply lines had been managed better, the collapse of the enemy lines, the only hope of German victory, might have come. The scarcity of war resources made the battles in the last years of the war take a very high toll in German lives. Each engagement meant the death of tens of thousands of soldiers who were already weakened by malnutrition and the terrible conditions of the trenches. Making their situation even worse, in 1918, one of the most brutal pandemics of humanity took place. Known as the Spanish flu, in just 2 years it killed 50 million people. And while both the Central Powers and the Allies were affected, Germany suffered much more from the consequences of this disease. By mid-1918, the Germans' numerical superiority had diminished and was only reversed by the arrival of the Americans. The Germans, seeing their comrades fall without ceasing, completely lost their fighting spirit.
Is that the German soldiers had been subjected to a barrage of propaganda about the efficacy of the German submarine blockade on Britain and how Britain was being starved into submission. And there, in these tremendous food supplies which they discovered in British rear areas, was the proof that the submarine blockade was not being anywhere near as effective as their superiors were telling them it was. And I think the destructive effect of that was considerable.
These feelings only worsened when soldiers realized that their officers generally did not suffer from the shortage of resources they did. Commanders often took possession of goods that were considered luxuries, such as tobacco, alcohol, or even meat rations. This inequality, coupled with the lack of motivation to continue fighting in a brutal conflict that was supposed to last only a few months, led to large contingents of German soldiers deserting their posts. Others went on mass strikes, calling for an improvement in their situation or even an end to the war. The collapse of morale also caused entire units to prefer surrendering to the Allies, rather than continuing to fight a conflict they did not think could be won. This discontent spread not only along the front lines, but also among the citizens, increasing social instability and the number of strikes and rebellions. The failure of the Spring Offensive in mid-1918 ended up destroying the chances of a German victory. All sectors of society were dissatisfied with the leadership of the empire. Citizens were starving, soldiers were dying, and even officers were harshly critical of the lack of direction of the leaders. This growing tension culminated in the so-called November Revolution of 1918.
Workers suffering from malnutrition and war weariness went on strike, and Navy sailors mutinied rather than sail out for a final suicide mission against the more powerful Royal Navy. Public anger turned against the Kaiser and the military who'd led them into the war, and a full-fledged revolution in early November forced Wilhelm to abdicate and flee to the Netherlands.
With Germany without its head of state, the Allies stepped up their propaganda campaign, calling on German citizens and soldiers alike to end hostilities. Many of them wanted to continue fighting, believing that victory was still possible. But most of the military high command had already accepted the harsh reality. World War I was over, and the former German Empire was one of the losers. On November 11, 1918, the Chancellor of the now German Republic signed the unconditional surrender of his country, ending more than 4 years of brutal conflict. What had been considered one of the most powerful world powers was now plunged into total chaos. The victors, through the Treaty of Versailles, singled out Germany as the main instigator of the conflict, and therefore deserving of brutal punishment. Its army was shattered and its industry destroyed, plunging the country into a terrible economic crisis. This in turn led to marked social instability. Although the revolution was over, clashes between communists and nationalists continued for years, claiming many lives. At the same time, discontent with the direction the country had taken gave rise to other movements of a more rigid and authoritarian nature. Among them, the one that would set the course for the following decades was National Socialism, led by Adolf Hitler. He pointed to certain minority sectors of the population, mainly the Jews, as the true responsible for the German defeat, calling them the internal enemy. Thanks to this and to his defiant stance towards the Treaty of Versailles, he gained the popular support necessary to take power in 1933. Immediately after becoming chancellor, he took economic measures that in just a couple of years managed to get his nation out of the crisis and markedly reduced the unemployment rate.
Al-Marshad suspendió, por orden de Hitler, el pago de las indemnizaciones a Francia, Bélgica y Reino Unido que el Tratado de Versalles estableció. Eso dio un gran respiro económico y se implementó el programa Reinhardt para la construcción de obras como vías ferroviarias, carreteras, autopistas, puentes modernos, obras enérgicas e hidráulicas.
The Allies, wanting to avoid the outbreak of a new conflict, allowed him these challenges. But the Führer's intentions would not be satisfied with the recovery of his country. Hitler would not rest until he had achieved what his compatriots had failed to do, the total conquest of Europe. We have now reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think there is another reason that explains the German failure in the First World War? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.